Guys, welcome to the Judincast for Social 20-1. This is episode 19. We're looking at the needs and motives of nation states. And this is the beginning of our Unit 5, which will include chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. It's 4 chapters in this unit, but they're all relatively short chapters compared to earlier chapters. So our topic for this unit is internationalism. Now, we spent time so far looking in this course. We've looked at introduction to nationalism, national interest, ultranationalism, self-determination. Now we're going to look at internationalism. And internationalism is a political principle which transcends nationalism and advocates a greater political or economic cooperation among nations and people. So it emphasizes cooperation perhaps at the extent of nationalism. So you can kind of look at nationalism being the opposite of internationalism. So what motivates nations and nation states to become involved in international affairs? Why engage in internationalism and not just entirely on nationalism? And a country like Canada, for example, places a high degree of emphasis on nationalism, but also a great amount of emphasis on internationalism. So what's the motivation here? Well, people's behaviors are motivated by both needs and wants. You, as a citizen, and the citizenry of a country as a whole, has various things that they need and various things that they want. Needs are things that people must have to survive, such as food, water, shelter, health. These things are not really optional in order to survive. They are needs. Wants are things that people desire. Cell phones, tattoos, any sort of luxury item such as that. Now, one may argue that you pretty much need a cell phone these days, but I think it would still fall in line with a want. So I'm going to introduce you this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this will perhaps help you explain to you why countries engage in internationalism. So, Maslow, who was um, a notable American psychologist, I believe he died around late 1960s, something like that. Um, he's famous for a number of things, but one of the things is this chart he creates in terms of uh, categorizing and ranking basic human needs and wants. So he believed that everyone ranked his or her needs in order of importance, placed basic survival needs at the bottom, and people would then work their way up through the levels until they became happy and fulfilled human beings. Some people believe human nature is too complex to follow this method. So it's not that this is a universally accepted method. It's not science. It's part of a social science, I guess, but um, there are critics of it. But there's a lot of people that think there's some truth to it. So we're going to apply Maslow's hierarchy of needs to internationalism as a way to explain why countries engage in international affairs and why don't they just focus on nationalism. And here is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a bit of a pyramid scheme. So triangle, actually. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom, your most basic needs are your physiological needs. This includes clean air, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep. If you don't have this, you can't have anything else, basically. Above that, safety and security, which includes health, employment, property, family, social stability. Then love and belonging, which includes friendship, family, intimacy, sense of connection. Above that, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, the needs of being a unique individual, and the highest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is self-actualization, where you have a sense of morality, creativity, spontaneity, acceptance. You experience purpose in life, meaning, and inner potential you can achieve. So the idea of this is, if you look at the bottom with physiological needs, if you don't have this, if you knock out that whole physiological needs, well, there's no way you can get safety and security. You can't have love and belonging. You can't have self-esteem, because if you can't even get a clean food and water, a place to sleep in, you're never going to achieve anything higher than that. Same thing of safety and security. If you look at the step above, maybe you have physiological needs, but maybe you live in a war-torn environment. If you don't have employment, perhaps maybe you don't have health at all, you're not going to achieve any of the upper categories. So this, you can look at this as reasons why countries will engage in international affairs, right? It is the goal of most nation states to allow citizens to experience all these things. As a nation state, you want to ensure that your citizens have their physiological needs met, their safety and security. They feel a sense of belonging in society, self-esteem, self-actualization, etc. So this is why countries will engage in international affairs. So what are some needs and motives of successful nation states? Behavior of nation states and nations is motivated by the collective needs and wants of the country's people. So collectively, what does a society want? And that will dictate the behavior of a nation, its domestic policies, its foreign policy. Nations and nation states are motivated to achieve and maintain the following: economic stability, peace and security, self-determination, humanitarianism. Um, and that's what we're going to look at in depth. We're going to look at each of these as individual motivations for why countries will do what they do in terms of international affairs. And all four of these are connected to needs and wants. When countries pursue these, they're better looking after all of these things back here on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So again, these are the four motivations: economic stability, peace and security, self-determination, humanitarianism. Basically, every society as a whole desires these four things. So what are these four things? Well, economic stability, of course, self-determination, peace and security, and also humanitarianism, you'll see, can be a motivation for nations. So let's look at these. Let's look at economic stability first. So it may involve getting an education, finding a job, saving money. Countries want their citizens to be employed, want them to be making money, spending money, getting education. They see, of course, not only positive to the nation, but this allows citizens to move up that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For a nation, they might decide to provide more money for training apprentices to attract more industries to the country, tax cuts to draw on in various industries, um, setting up the country economically so that you can establish some level of economic prosperity. Could include developing trade policies that support exports, will help keeping employment levels high in their own country. When people have jobs, they spend more money. When they spend more money and they create demand for jobs and for goods and services, this makes companies money, which makes more goods and therefore need to hire more workers. So it's a cycle. The idea in any nation state is, in order for citizens to achieve those high levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they need to have a situation where there's jobs. People with these jobs have money in which they spend. This creates more goods and services which are purchased, increases demand, which creates more jobs. So it's a cycle. So you can look at economic stability as a major motivation for nation states. If they have economic stability, then they are better looking after the needs and wants of their citizens. Number two, every country has motivated to establish peace and security. So safety is a strong motivator for nations and nation states. Society cannot function unless people feel safe doing things like attending school, going to work. Imagine if you do not live in a safe, secure environment, you're never going to reach those higher levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Nations promote safety by passing laws, creating police forces, making rules for the workplace. Nations promote security through their interaction with the rest of the world, and this can be a major motivation for why countries engage in foreign policy, why they engage in internationalism, why they work with other countries. That this can provide security for their citizens when there is a more broadly a secure and safe global environment. Avoiding war is a strong motivator. Most nations are motivated to create alliances to protect themselves against conflict. NATO, of course, which Canada is part of, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a defensive alliance, which is primarily led by the United States, but involves a number of other Western countries. Um, and the goal is to maintain collective security. So that's the motivation for Canada to join something like NATO, is to address a number of those needs and wants on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that this can provide some level of stability and security for citizens. And then they don't have to worry about their security and they can move up that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're also part of NORAD, which is North American Aerospace Defense Command, defends airspace in North America. We're part of the UN, which is an international body to help nations solve conflicts and problems before they escalate. The United Nations, it's a great example of internationalism, of countries working and cooperating together to try to address issues that arise. And this provides safety and security for citizens and thus allows people to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you just consider this case, and this one I got from the textbook, that in 2007, these women lived in a refugee camp in Darfur, region of Sudan. In Sudan, about 2.5 million people had fled their homes because of fighting between the government forces and rebels. This fighting has destroyed many people's peace and security. What might be some long-term effects of this lack of peace and security? Well, if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how are they going to achieve, first of all, peace and security? How are they going to achieve self-esteem, a sense of belonging, and finally, self-actualization? If you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, they're not even getting safety and security. Like, they live in a dangerous environment. They've been forced to flee as refugees. That's why people become refugees. If the situation was great in their home country, they wouldn't flee their country to become refugees to try to find refuge in another country. They have no reason to flee to another country. People become refugees when their physiological needs and in their safety and security are not being met. In the case of Darfur, which I just talked about, well, they very well may not be getting adequate access to shelter, food, water, clothing, sleep, etc. So they may not even be getting their physiological needs met. Third motivation, so we looked at economic prosperity. We looked at peace and security. We're going to look at self-determination now. Most people, you as well, are highly motivated to control your own lives, right? You're not going to live in your parents' house for the rest of your life. Why? You want to become self-determined. It's a motivation in your life. It's why you want to get an education, get a job, so you can successfully move out and become self-determined. If you don't have a job and you do not have enough education to get a job even, well, you're not going to become very self-determined because you're going to become reliant on your parents potentially. Nations have the same motivation. This, of course, is the topic of our last unit, self-determination. So, with self-determination, nations that are controlled by another nation may even decide to seek sovereignty. We looked at that. Canada, eventually, we wanted self-determination. Of course, we break away from Britain. We talked about earlier in the course, World War I, that a number of countries broke away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They wanted self-determination. So the way to look at self-determination is this is also a motive for nations to engage in international affairs, to protect their self-determination. That sometimes cooperating with other countries, working together on issues will allow they themselves to become self-determined or to maintain their self-determination, to not be subject to the whims of another country. And this just shows you Europe. 1914, Europe 1919, after the breakup of a couple countries, major empires actually, you have more self-determination states. This is something every nation is motivated to achieve. So we've looked at peace and security, economic prosperity, self-determination. Let's look at the last motivation, which is humanitarianism. There is a motivation in many cases to help others. Nations attempt to relieve suffering and protect the innocent. And humanitarianism is acting to support the dignity and well-being of all people, be external or internal. So helping people within your country or externally. And this is a motivation for countries that for many people and many nations, in order to reach self-actualization, which is the highest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it may involve humanitarian efforts, a feeling of accomplishment from relieving the suffering of people around the world in other countries or within your country and protecting the innocent. This is why Canada is, in part, why Canada sends peacekeepers to various countries. That there is a part of Canadian society that desires to become humanitarian, to support the dignity and well-being of all people. Last thing I'll just talk about here is failed states. So when a country neglects to achieve even the most basic things on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, such as the basic physiological needs, basic safety and security, they become what's called a failed state. So a failed state is quite simply a country that is not able to provide for the basic needs of their citizens. I'll give you a definition here. Countries that cannot or do not meet the needs of their citizens may be classified as failed states. And there's a video here. I think it ranks the top 20 failed states in the world, and it gives specific reasons why. There's a variety of reasons in each country: war, lack of healthcare, lack of education, lack of economic prosperity. In some cases, may not be self-determined at all. So, and this just lastly here just kind of compares two countries that are relatively close to each other in Africa. And you can see one is doing a better job of looking after the needs and the needs and motives of its citizens. Compare Botswana and Zimbabwe. GDP per person, way higher in Botswana. Way worse inflation in Zimbabwe. Higher life expectancy in Botswana. Less debt in Botswana. More physicians per person, more hospital beds per capita, etc. So Botswana, in all these different indicators, is doing much better in looking after the basic needs of its citizens. And you can consider in this case, if you look at a number of these things, Zimbabwe in many ways is a failed state, or was at this time anyways. So when we look at if a country is a failed state, there are very specific statistics that you can look at to identify that. So I'm going to stop right there. That is it in terms of needs and motives of nation states. Take care.